Von Clausewitz once said, "War is a continuation of politics by other means." But consider then the other implication, that politics is a continuation of war by peaceful means. Hello everyone, this is Venom Geek Media here, and today I'm going to be covering Romulan politics. Why? Well, I've wanted to for a while, but I think particularly in the context of the Dominion War and in the context of the reman regiments, it's actually quite an important topic to discuss, more so than Federation or Klingon politics. In many ways, those are powers that didn't have much of a choice about whether or not they joined the Dominion War, and the politics of both sides really didn't allow for much of a debate on the matter of war. War was happening, they didn't really have much of a say in it, compared to the Romulans, for whom the domestic politics during the war is incredibly important, and that domestic politics shapes a lot of the strategic and tactical decisions made by Romulan commanders in the war, not least in the formation of the reman regiments, which we have previously covered. So today we're going to take an in-depth look at Romulan politics. My intention with this video is to consider political environment. You see, politicians could be said to be animals. They are evolved for the habitat which they inhabit. They are shaped by the conditions of their environment and make necessary adaptations to survive and follow the inherent incentive structures, the implicit incentive structures present in the environment. So, this leads us to a bit of a question, a bit of a dilemma. Do people shape politics, or do politics shape people? So what we're really going to be looking at today is the structure of Romulan politics and how, in my view, it shapes the Romulan people and the Romulan state, and how its incentive structures work, because that, I think, more than anything, lends to a more clear analysis of the various political questions that were being asked during the Dominion War. And of course this factors in very much to the formation of the reman regiments and the subsequent political fallout. So without any further ado, let's get right into it. So one of the first things I want to clear up is that a lot of people will have it in their heads that the Romulans are some kind of authoritarian dictatorship. Romulus is not Cardassia, let me stress that. While culturally Romulans and Cardassians are actually quite alike and have very similar structures and institutions, they are not an authoritarian military junta in the way that Cardassia has been for, well, most of its recent history. Romulan politics and the Romulan Empire is, in fact, an authoritarian democracy. Now, this is important because we tend to think of politics in a sort of binary. We tend to think that you can only, if you have democracy, then you cannot have authoritarianism, and that if you have authoritarianism, you cannot have democracy. We have this mutually exclusive idea, if people embrace free markets, then they embrace free politics. What we actually see is, in the case of the Romulans, is in fact there's multiple different formulations, and they are viable. And that is really what mounts such a challenge to the Federation. The Federation has this human idea of universal democracy, but actually these other races, it's not that they're just these totalitarian dictatorships run by despots. They have organized themselves in a different fashion and think about politics in a different way to the Federation, and that's ultimately what tends to pit them against the Federation. So, as I say, Romulus is not Cardassia. Another thing that people might think is that Romulus, well, it's an empire, so there must be an emperor, right? Well, maybe, a long time ago, but there hasn't been one for a very long time. The emperor was likely overthrown at some point, probably by the nobility, or maybe by popular uprising. We don't know. It's also an authoritarian state, but it has democracy, which suggests that perhaps after overthrowing their emperor, they experimented with republicanism. But ultimately, we get neither an absolute monarch or an absolute democracy. We've landed somewhere in between. This is because both systems have inherent problems. A full democracy tends to lead to short-term thinking. Politicians get elected and they're only concerned with really whatever they can do within their term, and they're thinking about surviving to the next election and the next election. So they're thinking in these sort of short cycles, rather than carrying out any kind of long-term planning. It also creates inherent social division. If all the power of the state is up for grabs every election, that's a lot of power, and you don't want the people you disagree with to have that power, because my goodness, what will they do if they have it? So, that's a problem. And then the other issue is that when it comes to foreign policy, it can lead to a lot of inconsistency. It can make your state very erratic and hard to deal with. Contrast that with an absolute leader. This does allow you to have long-term thinking, but it also tends to create a barrier to new ideas. Generally, the all-powerful leader will develop an inner circle, and no matter how competent they were 20 years ago, it's 20 years hence, and it's the same people giving the same guy the same advice for a world that has long since moved on. And you might say, well, bring some new blood in. Well, it's hard to be the new blood because you might give the boss some bad news. And when your boss is the absolute authoritarian leader, you don't really want to do that. And not to mention it makes you look bad, even if you don't get, taken out and shot for delivering bad news. You're not exactly going to be very popular with everyone. So the modern Romulan system basically tries to balance the benefits of democracy and the benefits of authoritarianism in order to create a stronger state. So Romulan politics is basically broken down straight down the middle. Basically, there are two halves of Romulan politics. This is divided between two main governmental bodies. That is the Senate, a democratically elected body that is elected by the people and of the people, and the Continuing Committee, which selects its own members from the various institutions, the state institutions, as well as the Senate, but that is an appointment for life. Once you are selected for the Continuing Committee, that is for life. And so you get this authoritarian Continuing Committee and this democratic Senate, and you put them together to create a state that is simultaneously authoritarian absolutist, but also democratic. The Senate is led by a proconsul. Now, we're not exactly clear whether the proconsul is themselves elected in something like a public election, so a general election, and as well as voting on your senator, you get to vote on the proconsul, a bit like a presidential system, or if the proconsul is voted by members of the Senate, a little bit more like a parliamentary system. This is complicated by the fact that, as far as we can tell, there are no coherent political parties in Romulan society. And this is a very deliberate action undertaken by the Tal Shiar, because political parties are seen as overly polarizing and crystallizing. By having political parties, you make it red versus blue. Politics becomes far less dynamic. For the Romulans, they quite enjoy the dance of politics, that while you agree with certain senators on this particular issue, you might not share their view on another issue. So the lack of political parties is maintained because it allows greater freedom for senators, and it allows the most effective senators to rise to the top, theoretically. It's a much more confrontational form of politics. There's a lot of argument, a lot of rowdiness in the Senate. It can get quite heated in the Senate, and it's very confrontational. Again, you get different parties and different groups which sort of band together over different policies. So alongside the Senate, you then have the Continuing Committee, which, as I say, that is a lifetime appointment if you make it. And generally, it's not so much politicians. There are politicians in there, but it will be admirals, people high up in the sciences and academia, lawyers, military leaders, leaders in the secret police, these kind of state officials. And the election of these people to the Continuing Committee has to be unanimous by the members. But it is the praetor who selects these people for the vote. So it is led by a praetor who himself is selected by the previous praetor, Once again, that allows a level of consistency even as you bring in new ideas, because hopefully the Praetor has selected a successor that will build on what they've been doing rather than go back to the beginning and start all over again. The Continuing Committee, unlike the Senate, is much more strategically oriented. The Senate really only tackles domestic politics. That's what the Senate is about, is domestic policy. The Continuing Committee handles things like international relations and overall strategic planning, and it is much more intimately tied in to the state institutions like the Imperial Navy, the Tal Shiar, so on and so forth. So in that way, it's a little bit more apolitical, and in many ways could be seen to be a bit of a secret club, a secret cabal, since you have to be appointed by the in-group to even get in there. So it's a lot more closed than the Senate, deliberately so. But the idea is that the Continuing Committee is, in its nature, a more collaborative undertaking. It's people of similar mindsets working together to formulate policy, unlike the Senate, which really thrives in division and debate. It's seen as a healthy thing to have both, that you have these collaborative forces that work together to formulate an external strong front, but internally you also, allow that debate to take place in the public square. So I suppose the next thing to talk about, because I've talked about how the Romulan state and Romulan politics is authoritarian, but why, if they can elect people to the Senate and the Senate can debate on things, where's the authoritarianism? Well, let's get into it. You see, there are topics that are essentially acceptable as part of the public discourse, and topics that are discouraged / you're not allowed to talk about them, because to talk about them is dangerous and goes against basically the entire orientation and momentum of the Romulan state and the Romulan people. So, for example, acceptable topics of discussion could include taxation and expenditure, social programs. Specifically, let's be clear, these are social programs for true Romulans, not the servitors or slave castes, but for true Romulans. True Romulan bread for true Romulans. An extension of that could be a policy of Romulanization. So how are we going to take this conquered species and alter them better to fit with Romulan values and Romulan ideals? Education, what is talked about in education, that is very much a topic of debate. What should be taught, what shouldn't be taught? Should we talk more about the early period of Romulan history, the sort of proto-Vulcan, proto-Romulan history, or should we just talk squarely about the modern stuff? All of this is important to how the Romulans go on to view themselves in the future, and does affect their politics. The fact that the Romulan education system often suppresses any mention of their Vulcan ancestry actually tends to backfire when Romulans do encounter Vulcans, because oftentimes they find the Vulcans utterly fascinating creatures. Romulans and Vulcans are both very curious creatures, and they're very curious with one another because they have such different ways of approaching things. I'd also just like to point out a small note to understand. There's this misconception that on Vulcan, during the time of awakening, when Surak went around spreading the word of logic, that the people that destroyed Vulcan were those that became the Romulans. And this is not true. It's more likely that there was a group of proto-Vulcanoids that were neither Romulan or Vulcan in their philosophical outlook, because they were just incredibly violent, completely unrestrained, and those are the ones who wreaked devastation upon Vulcan. The difference between Romulans and Vulcans is both of them actually seek to avoid active conflict, they just have different means of going about it. For the Romulans, it becomes about deception, subversion, of doing everything you can to overcome an enemy, short of actually fighting. Politics is a continuation of war by other means. Whereas for the Vulcans, the embracing of logic and the avoidance of those drivers was seen as the solution. And so both the Romulans and Vulcans have moved away from that hyper-violent proto-species from which they proto-civilization from which they descended, and now just have different ways of dealing with the same reality. Sorry for that tangent, but that's just to show the importance of education in Romulan society and why it is a matter of debate. Because the Vulcans are an alternative view, and potentially that might be dangerous. But equally, you could use it to explain or demonstrate how actually the Romulan approach is superior. Crime and punishment is also another popular topic as well as social reform. What is unacceptable then in Romulan politics? Well, it's kind of vague, and it depends who you are and what your station is. But some pretty good ways of losing political capital and or disappearing are to question Romulan foreign policy or actively oppose. You can question Romulan foreign policy if your questioning of Romulan foreign policy is that they're not doing it enough and they should be doing it more and better and harder. That's an acceptable way of criticising Romulan foreign policy, but any other view is likely to get you in some trouble. Another forbidden topic is to actually question the very system which operates in Romulan politics, to suggest that it should be one way or the other, that it should be extreme authoritarian or that it should be complete republicanism. That is very dangerous indeed, and that threatens to subvert and undermine the system, so that cannot be allowed. The system survives because it is in balance. That's why it exists, and has existed for so very long. So that is ultimately what is deemed acceptable and not acceptable speech or political views in Romulus, a full democracy, but also not quite. What is acceptable and what is not acceptable political views is deliberately vague, but that's just some guidelines. So in terms of how this works, well, the Senate can debate and vote on legislation. This is brought forth by the proconsul. He will bring forth an agenda, a direction which he wants to set for the empire and its people. At any point, the continuing committee can amend or veto this legislation. This is designed specifically as a safety measure so that the power of the continuing committee is not threatened by Senate legislation. So they have the ability to nip anything like that in the bud and preserve their prime position. The continuing committee has primacy over the Senate. Ultimately, their word goes, but the agreement is generally the Senate has its business and it should not interfere with the continuing committee, and the continuing committee should not interfere with the Senate's business. It's intended that actually the proconsul and the praetor should actually have quite a amicable and good working relationship, that they should square away between the two of them the domestic agenda and the international strategic policy. If the proconsul wants to perhaps he wants to do away with conscription and make the military professional, well, that kind of overlaps into the territory of the continuing committee, and so that's going to require a negotiation with the praetor, and they're going to have to work out a policy. Ostensibly, that's the direction that the proconsul wants to go in. The proconsul has been elected by the people. He's a representative of their will, so the praetor should be willing to move in that direction. But the job of the praetor is to bring stability to that system, is to not allow just whiplash domestic reform that happens so fast that it compromises the overall strategic integrity of the empire. So that's the thing. Domestic policy can undermine or risk strategic policy. But really, to understand, the system is deliberately opaque. You have this public square, you have this facade, if you like. Think about it like a theatre, right? You have what is going on the stage, and that's the Senate. The Senate is the stage, and everyone can see that, and everyone's sort of taking part in that, in the experience between the actors and the audience. It's not theatre in that it's an illusion, it's very, very real. It's a real show, and it really does matter. But the behind that is, you've got all these people working behind the scenes to move the scenery and the lights and the everything to change the actual sort of environment around it. So I suppose that's how I would describe the difference between not just the Senate and the Continuing Committee, but the other state institutions like the military and the Tal Shiar and the Science Bureau and the education system. All of that factors together to create the overall thing that you see on stage. So what this means is that we have quite an opaque political system, which is good because it means that the people high up have the ability to deal secretly and to save face. And what that means is that people are much more willing to be pragmatic than idealistic. To be pragmatic might be seen as political opportunism. It might be seen as being selfish or you're betraying your promises. Whereas if you are able to operate in a certain level of opacity, you can take the pragmatic decision over what your supposedly ideological tilt is. So I think with all this in mind, we should begin to ask the question, well, what is the intention of the Romulan political system? What does it serve to do? The Romulan government is a political apparatus that primarily prioritizes the long-term prosperity and power of the Romulan people and the Romulan state. It does not labour under any ideals of universalism. It is Romulus first. It is not bogged down with the whims and ego of nobility who all want a piece of the pie. It combines both a more sustainable and a more reactive state. It benefits from the long-term stability of a democracy, that ability to release social pressure and deal with those problems, whilst also allowing for a very reactive executive branch of the state that can act on crises very quickly. It combines democratic dynamicism with authoritarian action, and in so doing produces quite the effective political machine. And I'll just finish off by noting, in the Federation, when you go to vote, you are one of billions, nay trillions, voting on a Federation representative. Okay, you're voting for a representative for your planet. In the Romulan Empire, only Romulans get to vote. Only Romulan citizens get to vote. So, instead of being one in millions or billions among trillions, you're instead one among a few thousand to a few million, electing a Senate among, well, a few billion. All told, a Romulan citizen has more democratic power than a Federation citizen. And that's interesting to consider. One wields a disproportionate level of political power compared to the other. But of course, a Romulan citizen feels the weight of that political power a lot more than a Federation citizen does. So just to wind up, politics are, as you can see, not as black and white as you might think, and the line between freedom and tyranny is often quite blurry. The Romulan system shows how seemingly contrary systems and power structures can actually operate together, and it is a system which flourishes in its layers of opacity and subtlety. And ultimately, this political apparatus, this machine, works to lock people into cycles of conquest and domination, generation after generation. And so in many ways, it's very hard to really sum up as a system. But other than a system that has, as I say, propelled Romulus from being a nascent nothing power of nomads to being one of the great superpowers of the 24th century. So they must be doing something right. Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Leave your thoughts in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next video. Thank you to my members for supporting the channel. My glorious Navarks, Tully DT, Rella, David Reeves, Macross Schaffer, and Sean Farrell. My loyal commanders, Philip Tye, Birdmonster, Jeff Hallam, Mark Philippe, Robert Sampson, Narata, Nathaniel Mead, Gabe Logan, Adam Bowman, Nicholas Walsh, JC Tech Wizard, Alcara Dreamer, Joe G, Scotty O, and Der Monarch. And I salute my Centurions, Pendlebury,
Marcus Hall, Julian Arnott, Freedom Trooper, Ocolcatum Questo, John Nicol, Athie's Collection, Tobias Klein, Marzarine, Bird of Play D3, Khan the Skektal Overlord, David Jackson, Andy Clark, and Guy Haslam. And I thank all my loyal sub-lieutenants, and I welcome Austin Schumacher, DG Music, Brianna Cantwell, Y Kit Fan, Terrick, and Y Wreckers XCOM. Thank you all so much for supporting the channel, and I will see you all in the next video.